Thanks, Damien. So our first speaker comes from the academic realm, Eric Fournier. He's the research director at the Institute of Environment and Sustainability with UCLA. So Eric, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so you can share your slides.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. Hopefully you all can see my slides here. I'm the research director of a research center that is housed within the UCLA Institute for Environment and Sustainability. Our center is called the California Center for Sustainable Communities, CCSC. And I thought many of you may not be familiar with our work necessarily. So one of the ways that I could sort of introduce to you all the way that CCSC we approach studying these issues of energy equity and health is through this kind of diagram. So really at the center of our approach is because we're part of a nonprofit government-funded research institution, we are legally allowed to gain access to account level energy and water consumption data, both for investor-owned utilities, but also through direct agreements with some of the publicly owned utilities throughout the state. And we try to apply that data in a number of ways to sort of promote improved equity and health outcomes within the energy space. So the first of the things that we do is we build public tools. And this really started several years ago with our effort to create an energy atlas for the Southern California region. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that because part of the reason why I'm here is we recently completed an effort to develop a similar atlas for the 9 counties in the Bayren territory. And so I'll describe what that is and how it can be used to study these issues. In addition to that, we do traditional academic work. We write journal articles, teach courses, things like that. We also spend a considerable amount of our time doing research projects for CEC, other state organizations like the SGC, and also the National Science Foundation, things like that. I'm going to discuss one of our ongoing projects that we're working on for CEC around looking at the holistic benefits from holistic benefits from residential appliance electrification, specifically within disadvantaged communities. Because that's a difficult issue as the grid is still transitioning to full decarbonization. There's a trade-off between indoor air pollution and potentially ambient air pollution from the grid. And then finally, briefly, I'll talk a little bit about our sort of role in contributing to regulatory proceedings. You know, we do this as we can. It's a lot of work to stay abreast of all of the activities that are going on in the regulatory space, but it's something we realize is important. Okay, so the first project is sort of, this is our suite of public tools that we try to develop and make available to local governments, the general public. This started with our work on the UCLA Energy Atlas, which is essentially a map at different geographic areas of aggregation of historical energy consumption, both electricity and natural gas. In Southern California, we have 2 IOUs that serve those things separately. And so this project basically involves getting access to a really large historical time series of account level consumption and linking that account level usage to attributes of the building stock through sort of the geographic location of the accounts. And in that way, we try to, through these types of tools, these atlas tools, provide local governments with sort of enhanced context around the where and the why of energy consumption and how that's changing over time. And this can be really important for understanding how effective different types of energy efficiency programs have been, or where new measures should be targeted based upon sort of anomalously high energy use per square foot among a certain type of building or in a certain type of community. So we've, folks in the Southern California area, the SoCal REN have found this tool to be very helpful for those purposes, also for climate action planning and GHG emissions accounting. So we're really proud of this. We've recently, like I said, completed the development of a Bay Area Energy Atlas, which shares a number of similar features, but also has some different attributes that are tuned to the needs of the Bayren group. And, so for example, you can get data from the data analysts at the census tract level. And, we think this is really important for all of your guys' integrated efforts to pursue a strategy of, improved energy equity outcomes. So we're really excited about how this can be used, and the fact that you thought enough about our work and our approach to this issue to seek us out to help you build this out. So I'll then transition a little bit to talking about some of the types of things that you can use this type of more spatially explicit data to do in terms of coming up with analysis for what types of inequities exist in an area, and how you can maybe go about addressing those. So we recently published a paper last year in a journal called Elementa, talking about some of the inequities that we've seen particularly in the Los Angeles County region. So in these maps and in the charts, the areas which are highlighted in red are zip codes whose are dominated by census tracts that are designated as disadvantaged communities as by virtue of their Cal-Enviro screen scores. So these are areas where most of the territories are above the 75th percentile in terms of Cal-Enviro screen scores. And so if you look at I guess one of the traditional narratives in the energy space, particularly as pertains to disadvantaged communities, is that the housing stock or the building stock is very inefficient. They have older appliances, they're not well insulated, and thus they use more energy. But when you normalize that energy use per capita, because you tend to see much higher concentrations of people that live in those types of communities, you actually see a pretty clear trend that, per capita, people that live in disadvantaged communities are using less electricity and less natural gas on an annual basis than folks that live in more affluent areas. That's what these sort of trend lines are showing. And so when you start to do a similar type of per capita analysis in terms of rates of participation in different types of energy transitions, so let's say, for example, the adoption of electric vehicles or net metered rooftop solar, you see very similar and stark trends, right? There's folks that live in disadvantaged communities, seem to be left behind, and the trends going forward are not great in terms of these future rates of adoption. So that's one application. Another thing that we look at is, and particularly we looked at in this paper, is this idea of sort of sufficiency. So, we believe that there are folks that are using excessive amounts of energy, and you can see that if you take the energy use per capita across these zip codes and you make a histogram. There are some zip codes that are using, a factor of 4 or 5 in terms of the quantities of energy per capita per year. And there are also some communities that appear to be using a quantity of energy that you would maybe argue is insufficient for their needs in terms of comfort or safety or health. And so, this is one of the issues that we can use this type of data to call attention to. And it may be used for any number of things, from program targeting to rate setting or different types of things, because it's possible that you could sort of see a benefit from actually increasing energy consumption among certain types of disadvantaged communities who are really financially constrained. So then, in terms of some of the types of research that we've been doing, one of the really bigger active projects that we have now is for the Energy Commission, and this project is all about assessing sort of the net benefits of electrification efforts, appliance electrification efforts on air quality. And so, as I mentioned before, we know that generating electricity using natural gas, for example, results in the production of air emissions that have these sort of negative public health consequences. But we also know that if you electrify appliances, you're going to be removing the production of those emissions from inside the home, but potentially increasing the production of those emissions at the grid level and in areas where the grid generators are operating. So this study is all about trying to quantify the net benefits associated with that trade-off, and how those benefits will evolve as the grid evolves to be have higher levels of penetration of renewables and be increasingly decarbonized. So, you know, this kind of table just sort of summarizes our hypotheses around the directionality of these trends relative to different types of energy transitions. So we're focusing on appliance electrification, but we're also looking at things like vehicle electrification, the adoption of distributed energy resources like storage and rooftop solar, as well as building EE retrofits. So it's a very complex problem, right? There's a lot of change that's going on. There's differential rates of participation in these transitions, depending on which type of community that you're in. And so it can be really difficult to assess the sort of the net benefits associated with these things, but it's also really important. So we're excited by this study, and hopefully the next time I get a chance to present, I can speak more to the results. And then finally, some of the last things that we've been doing to the extent which we're able is engaging and commenting on regulatory proceedings, both for CEC and CPUC. Something we've been historically very active in is in energy data access and privacy aggregation procedures. We feel like it's really important because the way that the rules are set around who can access data and the ways that that data can be shared with the public is super important to identifying that inequities exist and later tracking efforts to remedy those inequities. And so it gets very much into the weeds, but we think that's really important, so we try to stay involved in that as much as possible. And then finally, we also try to comment on what the research agenda is like and sort of the ways that equity and disadvantaged communities are addressed in terms of research priorities at the state level around energy and increasingly the relationship between energy and health. And so most recently we did this in commenting to the CEC's distributed energy resource roadmap. These are the kind of 6 high-level priorities associated with that roadmap, and we tried to emphasize that equity should definitely be in here as sort of a similarly top-level objective. So that's sort of a broad overview of the type of things that we've been doing recently and our contributions. And I think I'm probably getting close on time, so I'm happy to step back and take questions from anyone that has them in the audience. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. We're actually doing pretty good on time.
We're good?
So,
okay.
Yeah.
Where are we at?
Probably like 10 minutes. So if you want to keep going on some points, or we can, I don't see any questions in the Q&A box. So if anybody has any, feel free to enter.
Yeah, so I think folks, may perhaps be most interested in what the new Bay Rain Atlas has on offer for your guys' area. What we try to do is provide access to aggregated consumption information in kind of a narrative form. So you can see at the top of the site here, you can say, I want to see total electricity consumption from buildings categorized by this type of attribute and grouped according to this type of geography. And so these are little drop-down menus that you can play around with to generate new maps and new tables and summary statistics about these different areas and these different aspects of energy consumption. You all being within PG&E territory, both gas and electricity are covered by the same utility. So we have all that data in one. And what we also do here is we normalize the consumption both of electricity and gas into a standard energy unit, which is BTUs. And then we also, we try to translate that into GHGs. But one of the things that we're finding now, particularly with the rise of CCAs, these community choice aggregations throughout the state of California, really, is that it's not calculating GHG emissions has become much more difficult because different customers in different rate classifications can be receiving and effectively a different renewable power content in the power that they consume. So we're working really hard to try to incorporate CCA data to get GHG emissions estimates associated with this consumption as well.
Great, Eric. We got a couple questions that came
Sure.
in. I'm just going to take these as they came in. This one's from Alice Sung. Does the Energy Atlas give us granular detail by building type? For example, public K to 12 schools.
Yeah, so there are different use types that are included in the Energy Atlas, and we have an institutional use type category that is not as specific as, let's say, K to 12 schools, but does encompass schools and other tax exempt property types. One of the challenges, there's two sort of challenges with developing those type of building use type aggregations. The first is the available use type information in the parcel data across multiple counties. You know, that parcel information comes from county assessors, and different assessors collect different types of information and record it in different ways. So there's a standardization problem that has to be solved first. And then the second thing is you need to ensure that the use type that you create for the purposes of your aggregation doesn't run afoul of these data aggregation laws or rules. So in California, for example, if I want to make a map of energy consumption at some specific geography, that geography must contain at least 15 unique accounts, and no single account can have more than 15% of the total consumption in that area. Otherwise, I cannot disclose it for reasons of privacy. And so that actually becomes a pretty significant consideration relative to certain types of energy use, but also certain types of use type designations that are narrowly defined. You end up having to mask a lot of geographies that violate that rule.
Great, thanks. Here's one from Venus Singla. Can you talk more about how energy efficiency was defined? Or I'm sorry, how energy sufficiency was defined?
Yeah, so in this case, we basically took the mean and created a bounds around the mean that was plus or minus one standard deviation, right? And we did that for the purpose of just articulating this concept relative to some data. There's certainly any number of different ways that, what constitutes the sufficient band of usage intensity is. But we just wanted to show how the distribution of energy use by community or by region has a really long tail. And that tail goes into very high levels of consumption that it's difficult to justify those in terms of like the service of basic needs or what you might need to do to live a decent productive life. So we don't necessarily say that this is where the boundary is, but we're trying to say that conceptually some boundary sort of does exist, and it's something that should be considered.
Great. We have a couple more minutes, so I'll just keep going with questions. Here's one from Payal Jain. I'm really sorry if I'm butchering everybody's names. Are there any, or what new policy measures have been suggested to address energy inequity that you know of?
Yeah. So I think, one of the things that we discussed in that particular paper is this idea that if you make a program, let's say a new program is developed and an area of eligibility is defined, and that program can be accessed by, let's say, going to a website and signing up or taking the initiative yourself as a ratepayer to sort of participate in the program. What we find is that although the idea with that program is you're making it equally accessible to everybody in the territory, because of the constraints on disadvantaged community members in terms of their time or their knowledge and awareness of these issues, you tend to get not very equitable outcomes in terms of the rates of participation in the disadvantaged communities versus not. And so that suggests that in terms of program design, more effort needs to be invested in sort of making folks that live in disadvantaged communities aware that these things exist and facilitating their participation. So you have to actually have an inequitable investment in terms of the advertising and the marketing of the programs to achieve a more equitable outcome. It's not just a matter of sort of saying, it's here for anybody to sign up. They can just come to our site or sign up for the program. That tends not to result in sort of equitable investment or engagement in the programs is what we're finding.
Yeah, that would be a good segue to the community action Marin presentation, but we do have 5 more minutes. So
Okay.
let's keep going with another question. This
Sure.
one's from Heather Whalen. How will data about low and high energy users be used? What are the proposed strategies to limit higher energy users? Increased fees, taxes, ideas on redistributing such funds to disadvantaged populations?
Yeah, I would say so. For us at UCLA, our approach to these issues is to try to make the data available to as many people as possible with as much context as possible for making those types of decisions. But we don't sort of presume that we're going to tell people exactly what the best solution is for their area, right? So that's why we call it an atlas, right? It's sort of we're just trying to make the information, the historical record of the information available in as accurate and consistent a way as possible so that, you know, policymakers, decision makers can hash out what those best strategies are relative to their needs and their constituents. So I don't think it's sort of my place to make comments on that. That's sort of not our objectives. We're just trying to draw attention to what the data is saying.
Great. Here's a question from Karen Christensen. In the slide showing impacts of different actions on indoor air quality and ambient air quality, it shows that residential vehicle electrification showed a decrease in, I believe it's IAQ. Was that considering replacement of gasoline-powered vehicles with electric vehicles? Did that play in at all?
Decrease. So yeah, when you start talking about electric vehicles, the system boundary becomes really important. Where are you drawing your line? Here, we're focusing on just the impacts associated with the electricity generation. You know, there's a lot of research coming out that, you know, even though electric vehicles are can be fueled cleanly from renewable sources that have no air emissions, the vehicle itself can still produce a significant amount of emissions from, you know, the wear on the tires and the brakes and things like that. And that actually is not trivial, can't be ignored. But here we're just saying, you know, we're trying to focus on sort of the emissions associated with the electricity that's used to charge the vehicle. And that was our choice of system boundary given the constraints of this particular study. But there's any other number of ways that you could define that differently, which might lead to different outcomes or expectations around the outcomes.
Great. Here's another one from Alice Sung. Have you found any anomalies in the data, meaning areas of high, medium virus screen percentage ratings with low consumption or sufficient?
Yeah. That's a good question. Yes, there definitely are sort of anomalous areas. And I think one of the challenges here in this study and is that we made the choice of using zip codes to do this type of work because although we could have used the different geography for aggregating the energy data that we have because we have it at a very granular level, many other types of energy transitions, the data for those transitions is only recorded at, let's say, the zip code level as the most granular unit. And so if we wanted to stack these things up and make comparisons across, you know, not only energy usage, but different types of transition participation, you got to use zip codes. Problem is, zip codes are not population preserving, meaning that different zip codes can have very different populations. They're not like geographies that you might find used in the census where you can expect the number of people living in one area are roughly equivalent, or at least statistically equivalent to the people living in the other areas. So you have to take, you know, results that are presented at the zip code level with a grain of salt, because you may have a particular zip code that has anomalous behavior, but that zip code could correspond to a university. Let's say some universities have their own zip code, right? Or, you know, zip codes can kind of be a little bit odd. So we try not to read too much into the results for any specific data point here, but focus on the trends.
Great. So that brings us to about time. There are 2 more questions from Alice, and I just want to remind folks that we're going to be doing breakout rooms at the end. So that would be a good way to get more of your questions for Eric answered. So thanks so much,
Thank
Eric.
you very much. I'll shut down the share and hand it over. But thank you very much for your attention.